Howdy, folks. This is just a reminder that if you like this content, you can help me out by liking, commenting, and especially by subscribing. And be sure to hit the bell notification so you always get notified whenever I have a new video. Hope you enjoy this.
So the next question I had was about the sinlessness of Mary. I think this is an infallible teaching. So Romans chapter 3, verse 23 says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." So a lot of Protestants, we read this passage and we especially focus on this second part where it says, "fall short of the glory of God." It seems as if that means only God can be without sin. And that's why Jesus was able to be without sin, because he is God. But this idea that Mary never sinned seems to contradict this verse, and it seems like it could have the potential to put her on the same level as God, whereas like I see a lot of Catholics almost pray to her like she is God. They ask her for things. They don't just ask her to pray for them. They'll entrust their soul to her and things like that. So my question is,
okay, we're adding a bunch of issues on the table.
I'm sorry.
Right,
and you can respond to all of them. The main thing is, do you have to believe that Mary was without sin, never sinned, to be a Catholic?
Okay. So you brought up Romans 3:23, and I'm tempted to want to respond to that, but we've been going.
Yes, respond to that. We've
been going for almost an hour on subject number one, and I don't have 3 or 4 hours for this, I'm afraid, today. I didn't budget that much time. Okay, so I may need to set that aside, because otherwise we're going to get into a conversation spiral about it.
I'm sorry, I should have asked you, how much more time do you have? That'll help me know.
I probably should go within about 40 minutes.
Okay. All right. I will keep it within that amount of time. So, yeah, so I'll go ahead and show the scripture. Okay. And for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God.
Okay. Now, I'm not going to have time to go back and forth with you about this if we're going to get to the other topics you want to cover. But just to give a basic response, this passage has to be read in context. If you read it in the context of the rest of Romans 3, then you will see a series of quotations about how there is none who is righteous, no, not one, blah, blah, blah. And it goes along like that. All of those passages are quotations from the Old Testament, and they are all contrast texts. Where they contrast the behavior of the wicked with the righteous. For example, that first one, none is righteous, no, not one, no one understands, no one seeks for God, that's from the Psalms. Specifically, the psalm it is from is the one that begins, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." And it's describing the fools when it says, "None is righteous, no, not one, no one understands." But it also, the same psalm acknowledges the existence of the righteous later on, where it talks about, like, they eat up my people like bread. And when you go through each one of these passages, they all are contrast texts where Paul has selected the behavior of the wicked. And so he's using this to document that there are wicked people even among Jews, because that's who all these passages are talking about. It's not just Gentiles who are sinners. Jews are sinners too, and it's on that basis he says all have sinned. Now, that's a generalized statement about mankind, but it does not imply that there are no exceptions. Adam and Eve before the fall were sinless. They were an exception. And that demonstrates for us that it does not make you godlike or God because you don't have sin. That's the original state of mankind. It's also the destiny of mankind. In the resurrection, none of us who are with Jesus are going to be sinners. God is going to make us all completely sinless. So we need to just distinguish the concept of sinlessness from divinity. They are not the same thing. And there can be humans who are sinless. There is an exception for Jesus. You'll notice in Romans 3:23, it says that all have sinned. Well, Jesus is part of all. He is, formally speaking, he's human. He took on a human nature, but there's an exception. in Romans 3:23 for Christ the second Adam. Also, Paul will say later on in Romans, the same book, this is in Romans chapter 9, he talks about how there was a time in their lives before Jacob and Esau had done anything good or bad. So there's a time in their lives when unborn babies have not done anything bad. They have not done any sin yet. And so there are exceptions. Romans 3:23 is a generalized statement about mankind, but it does admit of exceptions, like Jesus and unborn babies and Adam and Eve before the fall, and Catholics would say Mary. Now, as I mentioned, God is going to make all of us sinless. That's our destiny if we're Christians. What God did for Mary was give her the graces that Christians receive early, to make her A, a more fitted mother for his divine son, and B, to give us an example of what we can become. So Catholics agree Mary's redeemed by Jesus the same way we are. It was his death on the cross. It's just that the benefits of his death on the cross got applied to Mary earlier than they get applied to most of us for the two reasons I've mentioned. Mary, to make her a better mother for his son, and also to give us an example. So Mary is a redeemed creature just like the rest of us. She just got redeemed in a more spectacular way. God showed her more grace than he shows us. Having said all that, your fundamental question was, do you need to believe this in order to become Catholic? Well, this will be a little surprising to some folks, including in the Catholic Church. What the Church has infallibly defined is Mary's Immaculate Conception, that she was conceived free of any stain of original sin. And so you do need to believe that if you're going to be Catholic. But you asked a different question. You asked, do you have to believe that she's sinless throughout the rest of her life? Well, the Church does teach that she remained sinless because she didn't have original sin. She remained sinless, unlike Adam and Eve. They were also born immaculate, but they went on to sin. Mary did not. She made better decisions than Adam and Eve. That's the Church's teaching. The Church teaches she did not go on to sin. She didn't have personal sin. But it hadn't infallibly defined that. That is not something that has been infallibly defined by a council or a pope. And so even though it's the Church teaching, and even though some theologians would say, well, it's not a matter of faith, but it's proximate to the faith, formally speaking, this is a non-infallible teaching, and therefore, if one had really good reasons, one hypothetically could disagree as an exceptional case.
Okay, so if you wanted to go through the process of becoming a Catholic, I don't know what that process is like. If you're having to, I agree with all the teachings of the Catholic Church or something, but
I can tell you concisely what it is. What you confess when you become Catholic is you say the Nicene Creed, and then they have 3 added paragraphs. The first one says, in essence, I believe with divine and Catholic faith, basically all of the dogmas of the Church. These are things that the magisterium has defined to be divinely revealed. That's what a dogma is. And I accept with, I forget the term, but it's like certitude, those things that the magisterium has infallibly defined. These are not dogmas. So these are also infallibly defined. They're just not infallibly defined to be divinely revealed. And then the third is, and I accept everything else that the magisterium proposes for our belief. So you basically say the Nicene Creed, and then these 3 little added paragraphs that are a summary of these categories. You don't go through the individual beliefs in detail, but you agree with divine faith, you buy all the dogmas, you believe with ecclesiastical faith all of the infallibles, and you accept the rest, but it's understood that there may be disagreements in exceptional cases among that last category.
Okay, so what the Church has infallibly defined then is her Immaculate Conception. So does that mean she was born without original sin? Is that what that would mean? Okay.
Yeah, the macula is the Latin word for stain, and so she's born without the stain of original sin. Immaculate.
And I think I was reading this today. Would they say she was originally conceived with sin, the original sin, but then before her birth, it's like she had already been baptized, basically, like she had been cleansed of original sin before her birth? Or
No, that's a theory that some authors in history have taken, and I believe that some in the Eastern Orthodox Church may hold that today. The Immaculate Conception is from the first moment of her conception, God redeemed her. So there was never a time when she had contracted original sin and then got it removed. It's from the moment of her conception, she did not have it. So a comparison that was used, this is, I believe, John Duns Scotus proposed this example. Suppose you're walking through the forest and there's a big pit of mud, and you fall into the mud, and then someone pulls you out. Okay, that's like falling into original sin and then being redeemed from it. On the other hand, if you're walking through the woods and someone grabs you before you can fall into the pit of mud, they've saved you in an even better way. And that's like God prevented Mary from falling into original sin, which otherwise would have happened if he hadn't stopped it.
So am I understanding correctly that Catholics during baptism, they believe a person is cleansed of original sin?
Yes, given the way Catholics understand what original sin is. And there's a difference in how the terminology is used in Protestant and Catholic circles. In Protestant circles, it's commonly used to include not only an absence of God's grace, but also things like temptation. And so when a Protestant gets baptized, well, obviously we don't lose all our temptations. And so Protestants are inclined to say, well, baptism doesn't remove original sin. I've still got my temptations. But in the Catholic community, original sin refers to the absence of God's sanctifying grace, which Adam and Eve were unable to pass on to us because of the fall. Now, we also have temptations, but original sin itself in Catholic circles is the absence of sanctifying grace. So when we're baptized and God puts his grace into our souls, original sin is done away with. Doesn't do away with temptation. We still got that, but it does do away with the absence of God's grace.
Okay, and I thought this is actually a very interesting thing I've learned from Catholics is, like, I remember Trent Horn saying something like a lot of Protestants don't value the Eucharist like they should, and I've come to believe that too. And like part of why we partake of communion, and we want to do that on a regular basis, is we receive sanctifying grace, and you guys Catholics talk about grace as if it's almost like a power to live a godly life, an energy almost that's imparted into us, where now we're empowered to live a godly life. Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, there's we wouldn't use exactly that terminology. Catholics talk about two different types of graces. There are habitual graces that remain in our soul, and then there are what are called actual graces that give us grace to perform specific acts, like do something loving for someone. And sanctifying grace is the first kind. It's a habitual grace. But that doesn't mean it doesn't have a relationship to actual grace. But if you're talking about power to live the Christian life, to do specific good things that, please God, those would be actual graces that help us to do those.
And what is sanctifying grace then?
Sanctifying grace is a habitual state of holiness in the soul. That's why it's called sanctifying. Sanctifying and holy mean the same thing.
So like when I grew up, I was taught at salvation, your spirit is saved at the moment of salvation. Your mind is being saved. Your mind is being saved through the renewing of your mind. And your body will be saved one day when Christ returns. You'll be given a new body. Are you saying, like, is that sort of like when you say sanctifying grace, you're saying, because like what I was taught growing up is your spirit at the moment of salvation is pure and clean and always desires to do good after salvation. Your body still desires to do evil, And that's why you have to renew your mind so that you can train your mind to follow the Spirit rather than the flesh.
So here we're in an area that's more theological than doctrinal. So it's not that the church has a definite mandated teaching on all of these points. The church would be open to different ways of expressing these truths. There are aspects of truth in what you say. I wouldn't say theologically that you've exhausted everything to be said in this area. I think this is a very rich and robust and complex area.
I guess what I'm getting at, I'm wanting to make sure I'm understanding. So.
There is clearly a now and a not yet to salvation. And everybody who's Orthodox, Protestant and Catholic and Eastern Orthodox, everybody acknowledges there is a now and a not yet. And the question is then, how do you articulate what we have now and what we do not yet have? One of the things we have right now from a Catholic point of view is God's grace residing in our souls in a way that makes us pure and holy to Him. We are not yet holy in that we still have to struggle with temptation, and we can still fall into sin and become unclean before God, at which point we need to repent and we need His grace again. But exactly how you want to articulate that in terms of the body versus, the flesh, to use St. Paul's term, versus the spirit, there's a little more flexibility there, depending on how you define these terms and the conceptual map that you're using. But what everybody can agree on is God has given us His grace in salvation in a way that is pure and perfect and means we're not going to hell at this point.
Okay, so I'm asking all that to see if I'm understanding correctly. So basically, at baptism, Catholics would say that you receive that sanctifying grace, and that's why you get to go to heaven. Because, so my vocabulary growing up would say your spirit has been saved, transformed, come alive in Christ at the moment of salvation. Now you're a new creation in Christ. Old things have passed away. All things have become new.
Yep.
What you're saying is, so for all of us, normally that happens at baptism, but the Immaculate Conception just says that happened from the moment of conception with Mary.
Yes.
She had, whereas we would have that born again experience. She was basically just born again from conception.
Correct.
Kind of. But and the church teaches that she never sinned, but not infallibly. And so Catholics, they should, like you worded it, assume the church is right unless you have reason not to. But you could, at the end of the day, still be a Catholic and believe that she was immaculately conceived, kind of like born again at conception. But at one point, maybe she sinned sometimes later on.
Hypothetically, and it's going to be it's surprising to people when you first encounter this concept, but the ongoing personal sinlessness of Mary, even though the church teaches it, it actually hadn't been infallibly defined. And so, yes, hypothetically, one could disagree with that if you felt on an exceptional basis that you had sufficiently strong reasons to disagree with it.
Okay, man, that is super interesting. I am so thankful for this conversation. I don't think I would have learned that anywhere else. So I'll do really fast on these last ones.
A lot of Catholic apologists don't check the original sources as closely as I do. So yeah.
That was so interesting and good to learn.
And before we go, just one more reminder that if you like what you've watched, you can help me out by liking, commenting, and especially by subscribing. I'm trying to grow my channel, and I'd really appreciate your help. Thank you, and God bless you.